Now, tonight's magazine. We've all seen the images in the movies, on television. Mushroom clouds, symbols of a nuclear nightmare. Some countries have tested nuclear weapons, but how close has the world actually come to nuclear war? Tonight, the real story of a confrontation that nearly exploded, and new details about the crisis from the men who were there. Voices from the Brink. Here now with a full edition documentary, The National's Terence McKenna.
The highly acclaimed 1996 film Trinity and Beyond combined color film of test nuclear explosions with music from the Moscow Symphony Orchestra, heightening the unreality of the images. The closest the world came to a real nuclear war was the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. In the just-released White House tape recordings, you can hear President John F. Kennedy preparing to confront the Soviet Union.
Which leaves the only one alternative, which is fire nuclear weapons, which is a hell of an alternative, and begin a nuclear exchange.
The Cuban Missile Crisis, which played itself out for 13 days in October 35 years ago, was the climax of the Cold War. In the remarkable tape recordings made inside the Kennedy White House, you can hear the tension in the voices of the men who held the fate of the world in their hands. You can hear for the first time how John F. Kennedy stood up to relentless pressure to go to war, not just from his own generals, but from his friends and his opponents in the U.S. Congress. For all the remarkable cool and calm displayed on these tapes by the president and his key advisors, we now know that some of their calculations were shockingly mistaken, and that the world was much closer to nuclear war than we ever knew. The Cuban Missile Crisis began with the takeoff of an American U-2 spy plane from California on the morning of Sunday, October 14, 1962. The U-2 was designed to fly high and fast, to evade anti-aircraft missiles and photograph military installations. The photographs of Cuba taken that day revealed the construction of new missile sites from which Soviet nuclear weapons could be fired at the United States. The Soviets had promised not to place such offensive weapons in Cuba. The next morning at the White House, John F. Kennedy turned on his secret taping system to record the moment when the CIA first showed him the photographs.
How do you know this is a medium-range ballistic missile? The length, sir. The what? The length, yes. The length of the missile. Which part? I mean, which one?
Our missile man has some pictures of the equivalent Soviet equipment that has been dragged through the streets of Moscow that can give you some feel for it.
It's ready to be fired? How long? We can't tell that, can we? How long it was fired?
The president summoned his key advisors to consider how to deal with the threatening new situation. Strict secrecy was maintained until the U.S. government could decide on a course of action. For the next 13 days, the U.S. Crisis Management Committee met for hours and hours, usually in the cabinet room of the White House. At noon on that first Monday, Defense Secretary Robert McNamara presented President Kennedy with his military options against Cuba.
We could carry out an airstrike within a matter of days. We would be ready for the start of such an airstrike within a matter of days. If it were absolutely essential, it could be done almost literally within a matter of hours. In any event, we would be prepared following the airstrike for an air invasion, both by air and by sea. Approximately 7 days after the start of the airstrike, that would be possible if the political environment made it desirable or necessary at that time.
And I was there.
35 years later, Robert McNamara says the Kennedy administration had no idea of the dangers it was really facing.
We grossly underestimated the risk because at the time the CIA was reporting no nuclear warheads there. We later learned there were on the order of 162. We believed there were no tactical launchers or warheads there. We later learned there were not only the launchers, but there were tactical warheads, both bombs and missiles, to be used against an invasion force. We learned that there weren't 10,000 Soviet troops, there were 42,000. We grossly underestimated the risk.
On Tuesday, October 16th, President Kennedy became preoccupied with why the Soviet Union would take such a dangerous gamble in dealing with the United States.
Well, it's a goddamn mystery to me. I don't know enough about the Soviet Union, but if anybody can tell me any other time since the Berlin blockade where the Russians have given us so complete a provocation, I don't know what it's been, because they've been awfully cautious, really.
The question of why Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev took the deadly gamble of trying to sneak the missiles into Cuba remained a mystery for many years. One of the few people Khrushchev confided in was his son, Sergei, who learned of the plan almost 6 months before the Cuban crisis began.
He came to his dacha. It was
His
near the Moscow River, yes, his country house. And we, as usually, we walked around the Moscow River, and he told, you know, to protect the Cuba, it was only one possibility, to deploy the nuclear missiles. And I was a strong supporter of him. I have no doubt that we have to do this. It was not so much signal to the United States as to the other world. Yes, we are strong enough to protect all our allies. And I'm sorry, but we'll compare with the United States. It was the same policy. They told to all free world, we are strong enough, we will protect all of you against possible Soviet invasion. It was very similar behavior.
In the week of secret deliberations before the crisis became public, the president's top military advisors were all pressing relentlessly for a surprise airstrike against the missiles and airfields in Cuba. General Maxwell Taylor was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
We're impressed, Mr. President, with the great importance of getting a strike with all benefit of surprise, which would mean ideally that we would have all the missiles that are in Cuba above ground where we can take them out without any warning whatsoever.
On the other side of the argument were Attorney General Robert Kennedy and Assistant Secretary of State George Ball, who felt that a surprise airstrike would be a terrible political error.
Like Pearl Harbor, it's the kind of conduct that one might expect of the Soviet Union. It is not conduct that one expects of the United States.
No, I think George Ball is a hell of a
But
I think just the whole question of, assuming that you do survive all this, we don't have the fact that we're not war kind of a country,
the
fact that you
sense of carrying the Martha King on you around for the rest of your life or something.
we did this against Cuba. We fought for 15 years. It's for us being the first strike against us. We'd never do that. It's never be interested in time we do that to a small country. I think it's a hell of a very good carrot.
President Kennedy was also concerned that a surprise attack could lead to an escalation to nuclear war. He decided that a warning to Khrushchev, accompanied by a naval blockade of Cuba, should be the first public step. But military men were not happy about it. In a meeting with the Joint Chiefs of Staff on Friday, October 19th, General Curtis LeMay suggested to President Kennedy that he was being about as cowardly as British Prime Minister Chamberlain was in his meeting with Hitler at Munich before the Second World War.
Blockade and political action, I see leading into war. I don't see other solution to it. It'll lead right into war. This is almost as bad as the appeasement of Munich.
The Joint Chiefs of Staff all agreed with LeMay, but President Kennedy rejected their advice. In one of the most remarkable moments on these tapes, when President Kennedy leaves the room, some of his generals snicker behind his back about how they suggested he was a coward. General David Shoup was Commandant of the U.S. Marine Corps.
You'll pull the rug right out from under the surprise. What the hell do you need?
If somebody can keep them from doing the goddamn thing piecemeal, that's our problem. Doing that friggin' around with a missile, you're screwed. You're screwed. And if some goddamn thing, some way, you can say either do the son of a bitch and do it right, and quit friggin' around.
The newspapers on Monday, October 22nd, announced an urgent TV address to the nation by the president. Just before that speech, Kennedy called in congressional leaders for a briefing. They were very critical of his strategy, especially the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, Senator Richard Russell.
You have told them not to do this thing. They've done it. And I think that we should assemble as speedily as possible an adequate force and clean out that situation. Time will come, Mr. President. We're going to have to take this gamble. See Berlin and Korea and Washington, D.C. and Wanda, Georgia. Nuclear war. I don't know whether Khrushchev will launch a nuclear war with Cuba or not. I don't believe he will.
Let me just say that I said at the beginning that the person whose course of action is not adopted is the best on, because no matter what you do, we can go in there with an airstrike and you can have the United States, which some people would say, well, let's go in with an airstrike. You can have those bombs go off and blow up the 15 cities in the United States. They would have been wrong. So I better go and make this speech and
At that moment, President Kennedy rushed back to his office to give his television address to the nation.
We will not prematurely or unnecessarily risk the course of worldwide nuclear war, in which even the fruits of victory would be ashes in our mouth. But neither will we shrink from that risk at any time it must be faced.
By October 23rd, the United States Armed Forces had moved to Defense Condition 3. Bomber squadrons around the world were placed on high alert. Nuclear submarines left their ports. Anti-aircraft missiles were set up on Miami Beach. Jet fighters screamed over the city. Across America, civilians cleaned out supermarkets of canned goods and moved into their basements in case of nuclear fallout.
Americans people was crazy. They was ready to sacrifice their lives, but to push these missiles out, and you can do nothing.
In a civil defense briefing at the White House, President Kennedy was asking officials what could be done to protect the population in case nuclear weapons were fired at the United States.
What is it we could do to evacuate these communities so that, after all, the people living out in the country, we can take care of them to the extent it's possible to get radiation by various steps. Then we've got the problem of blast. Can we, say, before we invade, evacuate these cities?
There's a big fallout. The only protection that exists today is in the cities, and there's a little or no protection in the rural areas.
Now we have to assume that it's going to be there. The assumptions we're going, and we're not going to have an all-out nuclear exchange. We're going to have an all-out nuclear exchange, and we got this problem.
On Wednesday, the United States Navy moved into a ring around Cuba and prepared to impose a naval blockade. The Soviet government had publicly ordered their merchant sea captains and naval commanders not to submit to American search and seizure. Russian freighters with submarine escort approached the blockade line. At the White House, this was the moment of supreme tension. A chain reaction of military conflict could lead to nuclear war. President Kennedy asked his defense secretary, Robert McNamara, if they would attack a submerged Soviet submarine.
If he doesn't surface or if he takes some action to assist the merchant ship, or we're just going to attack him anyway. We don't want to have the first thing we attack is the Soviet submarine. I'd much rather have a merchant ship. I think it would be extremely dangerous, Mr. President, to try to support an attack on this submarine in the situation we're in. We could easily lose the American ship by that means. Okay, let's proceed.
At that moment, CIA Director John McCone arrives with an intelligence report on 7 Soviet ships close to the blockade line.
What do they say they're doing with those, John?
Well, they either stop them or reverse direction.
At that particular moment, as I recall it, we received notice that the ships that we were following, the Soviet ships we were following from the Black Sea or from other Soviet ports into the Caribbean, stopped dead in the water. We'd taken B-52 aircraft and B-52 tankers off their normal operations and sent them out to photograph and follow these Soviet ships. And we were plotting them every night. And all of a sudden, we saw them stop dead in the water. We knew that Khrushchev had made an important decision. We weren't quite clear what the full implications were, but the tension just subsided immediately. It was a fantastic moment.
In a report published this year, Cuban leader Fidel Castro talked about the unreal atmosphere of the missile crisis in his circle. He said, "We were in the antechamber of the Holocaust and we were cracking jokes. Of course, we knew we would be made to play the part of the dead man, but we were determined to play the part." There were lighthearted moments in the White House as well. At one point, CIA Director John McCone complained about the military's difficulties in arranging the naval blockade. On Thursday, October 25th, low-level U.S. reconnaissance flights over Cuba showed that the Soviet technicians were finally trying to camouflage their missiles. At the White House, the president was puzzled.
Explain to me this whole Russian thing someday. Why they didn't camouflage it before? Why they do it now? At what point they thought we were going to find it out?
I asked my father what can happen, and he really told that military assured him that Americans will never discover this. Because they told, we will camouflage these missiles at the palm trees. I asked several times why Americans will accept that missiles look like the palm trees. But they told, yes, we will camouflage them, they will see nothing.
The low-level reconnaissance flights over Cuba also showed that the missile construction was speeding up. Although the Soviets were respecting the blockade, the threat to the United States was increasing. Cuban anti-aircraft guns began shooting at the U.S. jets. At the White House, plans were being made for a full-scale invasion of Cuba.
Well, the military plan now is very clear. A limited strike out. So the military plan now is basically invasion.
The U.S. reconnaissance photographs showed some Soviet battlefield missiles that could be used against an invasion force, but the CIA was sure that there would not be nuclear warheads on the missiles. They were wrong. Invading American troops could have been incinerated on the beaches of Cuba.
Had we launched the attack, without any question, we would have faced a very, very serious Soviet response. I believe it would have included the use of the tactical nuclear warheads on the soil of Cuba. Our troops were not equipped with tactical warheads. What would we have done? We would have launched aircraft from the U.S. with nuclear warheads against Cuba. Where would it have ended? An absolute catastrophe.
Nikita Khrushchev personally authorized his senior general in Cuba to use the tactical nuclear weapons, according to Sergei Khrushchev.
He told him, General, it was oral, if you will lose the communication with Moscow, it will begin the American invasion. You will understand that it is no other choice. You may use it, but you must think twice.
This year there have been other new revelations about what was going on behind the scenes in Moscow in 1962. The minutes of the meetings of Khrushchev's Politburo have been published in a new book, One Hell of a Gamble, by Soviet historian Alexander Fursenko and Canadian Timothy Naftali, a professor at Yale University.
What is frightening about the new evidence on the Soviet conduct in the Cuban Missile Crisis is that the Soviets didn't understand that using small nuclear weapons on the island of Cuba would have necessarily brought us into a general nuclear war. They didn't think in those terms. Americans thought in those terms, but the Soviets didn't. And that's what's so shocking.
On Saturday, October 27th, at the climax of the missile crisis, the Kennedy White House and the Khrushchev regime were in tense, high-stakes negotiations of a potential trade. The Soviets would withdraw their missiles from Cuba in exchange for a withdrawal of U.S. Jupiter missiles, which were stationed on the Soviet border in Turkey. Deliberations in the Kennedy White House were interrupted with the news that an American U-2 spy plane had just been shot down over Cuba.
The U-2 was shot down. The fire against our low altitude survey was shut down. Yes, Rogers said it was not shut down.
Pilot killed? Well, this is much an escalation by them, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. And it's on the ground.
On the ground. The record's on the ground. Pilots didn't take it.
They fired the first shot.
I think we ought to announce that, and that
action will be taken to protect our aircraft in a position to attack quickly. We've been fired on today. You can't do this very long. We're going to lose airplanes. You can't maintain this position very long. So we must be prepared to attack Cuba quickly.
We now know that Nikita Khrushchev had not given permission to shoot down the American U-2. He was very upset at the escalation and worried that the situation was spiraling out of control.
Following the shoot down of the American U-2, tension rose again in the Soviet leadership. Khrushchev brought together the top leadership of the Soviet Union and announced that a retreat was necessary. In order to save the world, we must retreat, he said. There was quiet. It was clear to all that Khrushchev didn't even want to wait to hear if Kennedy would give him the Turkish missile concession. The world was coming too close to nuclear war.
The announcement from the Soviet Union came on Sunday morning, October 28th.
This is Radio Moscow. Premier Khrushchev has sent a message to President Kennedy today. The Soviet government has ordered the dismantling of weapons in Cuba, as well as their crating and return to the Soviet Union.
President Kennedy ordered that there should be no gloating on the American side. He declined to address the nation and instead went off to church. For the American Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, 35 years later, the lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis are overwhelming.
We came much, much closer to nuclear war than people at the time understood, and much, much closer to nuclear war than people today understood. And there is a lesson to be learned from it, and we, the human race, have not learned that lesson. The lesson is, this we all know, we all make mistakes. In our daily lives we make mistakes. Those of us who've served in the military know the military is full of mistakes. And we kill people as a result of mistakes, 1,000 or 10,000 or maybe even 100,000. But we haven't yet destroyed nations. There's a learning curve in daily life, and there's a learning curve in military. And the conventional wisdom is don't make the same mistake twice. Learn. Well, we sometimes make it twice, don't make it 3 times. There's no learning curve with nuclear weapons. You make a mistake in the use of nuclear weapons, you're going to start a nuclear war. It's going to destroy nations. And therefore, the conclusion of the missile crisis, in my mind, is the indefinite combination of human fallibility and nuclear warheads will lead to destruction of nations. We ought to get rid of nuclear weapons. That's the lesson of Cuba.
In this recently declassified film, you can see the United States military experimenting with battlefield nuclear weapons in the Arizona desert. The idea was to see how close soldiers could come to actual nuclear explosions. Now we know that in 1962, the whole world came very close to nuclear war. With the proliferation of nuclear weapons to many countries and many potential battlefields around the globe, the lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis could well come into play again. For The National, I'm Terrence McKenna in Washington.